Good morning, my friends. Thanks for joining me on this, another of our Unfolding the Word times. According to my calculation, it's Sunday morning. I hope it's a morning you'll be able to join with your church family. I know many are still struggling to be able to meet in the midst of this COVID period. We've been studying in recent days Genesis chapter 4 and encountering the first family in history, and particularly the crisis that emerged between Cain, firstborn, and Abel, the secondborn, on how they were going to respond to what God had taught about the proper way to deal with sin and to come into his presence to find both forgiveness and reconciliation. And we saw they represented two distinctively different ways of approaching God that continue to the very present day. We've begun looking at some of the outworkings of it, particularly as it related to Cain, some of the terrible and tragic consequences of his choice and continuing choice to reject God's way. I want to pick up our reading today in verse 11 and 12 of the 4th chapter. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength, and you shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. We saw in verses 5 and 6 that the first of the tragic outcomes for Cain was a deepening, unjustifiable anger at God. Instead of seeing God's response to his improper approach being a way to lead him to repentance, bow his knee, and come properly, instead he got angry at God for not accepting him on his terms. We also saw that he had an ever greater problem with sin because it was overcoming him in a way it hadn't even previously, because inevitably that's the outcome. We become less effective in resisting sin in our lives when we're not in right relationship with God. Yesterday we saw that Cain found a growing hatred in his life toward those that God did accept, who had come to God properly, and most especially it was focused on his brother Abel, and eventually led to his taking of his brother's life. We also saw that this anger toward God, this resentment over not being accepted on his own terms, and his refusal to take God's way, led him to a place where his relationship with God became one of dishonesty, became one of just putting on the show, not being straightforward with God. Now today, we're going to look at another of these tragic consequences. And particularly, we're going to see how the outcome of sin and rejection of God's purpose had an impact on the work life of Cain. His anger and unresolved anger made his work no longer refreshing, no longer satisfying for him, according to verses 11 and 12. Although the fall had made the gardening work and any other work in this fallen world a work that had thorns and thistles and sweat of the brow tied to it, that work, even with those limitations and consequences of the fall of man, was still intended by God to be a source of blessing to the man, to the woman, as they worked productively to accomplish his purposes in this world. Ecclesiastes 2:24 picks up on that very underlying purpose of God. Listen to these words. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. Finding enjoyment in his toil. But yet at the same time that particular purpose in our labor and our work is made plain by God, another thing is made plain in the verses preceding that in the book of Ecclesiastes. In chapter 2, verses 20 to 23, we read these words. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and understanding and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by somebody who didn't toil for it. This also is a vanity and a great evil. For what is a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he has toiled beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart doesn't rest. This also is vanity. All right. God designed us, even in the framework of a fallen world, to find a certain enjoyment in our toil, and yet that toil and that enjoyment is tainted and undercut by someone who is seeking to live their life by finding their meaning and purpose in their toil instead of in their relationship with God. And of course that ends up in a vanity and an emptiness. Frustration in work is an inevitable outcome. We can find grace from God to deal with that as we're in right relationship with God, but particularly when we're not, that frustration has nowhere to get resolved. Despite that, God has made it very plain in His Word that He doesn't give us a choice about whether we continue in work. He has commanded us to do so. That's part of His intention in this world. He has commanded us to provide for ourselves, to provide for others that we have responsibility for. Our labor may not be fun, it may not be ultimately fulfilling, but it is purposeful because it is, at the very least, providing for our needs, which is something God lays on our shoulders as a responsibility. I was thinking of 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 in this regard. Let me read you some verses from that, starting in verse 6 of the 3rd chapter. Now we command you, brothers, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you keep away from any brother who is walking in idleness, and not according with the tradition you received from us. For you yourselves know how you ought to imitate us, because we were not idle when we were with you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with toil and labor we worked night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. It wasn't because we didn't have that right, but to give you in ourselves an example to imitate. For even when we were with you, we would give you this command: if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. All right? God's plan and purpose here is pretty plain, isn't it? He says here in these verses, stay away from the people walking in idleness. By choice now. Somebody can be out of work due to circumstances outside their control. But somebody who's choosing to walk in idleness instead of productive labor, stay away from such people. Don't reward such choices. He says if they're not willing to work, don't let them eat. People say, well, that sounds awfully harsh. Well, it sounds awfully biblical to me. God's saying, hey, this is the way that you respond. And you try to do it because it's in their best interest, because of God's very design for them, the way He created them, that they would be involved in labor, in productive labor. And then He says, listen, I command you to earn your living. I command you to work in productive sort of fashions. At any rate, God is saying that we need to do that. What we find with Cain is that even in the face of trying to do that, if we're out of right relationship with God, even that aspect of our life is undercut by it. And it's no longer satisfying for our lives. It will no longer yield to us our strength. So let me pick up on that piece of it here in the few minutes that we have remaining. For Cain, labor in the fields, remember his profession was a worker of the ground, as we saw at the beginning of the chapter. God said, now Cain, the work you do in the ground is no longer going to yield its strength for you. It will no longer yield to you the outcome of strength. Now, what's he talking about there? Well, theologians have looked at it and come up with three aspects that it's probably referring to. All three possibilities could be being the intent here, because they all three could be true. But let me cover them with you to try to make it plain to you. To no longer have the ground yield its strength could first of all mean that the work that previously was satisfying to you would not be satisfying to you anymore. In other words, you had chosen to be a tiller of the ground, work the ground, instead of being a shepherd, because you enjoyed that work. Now what's going to happen is that you're not going to enjoy it to the same degree. That could be part of what's going on here. Part of the consequence of being out of right relationship with God is even those things that we formerly liked, now we've become soured on. It's also possible that God is saying here, because what's coming up for you is to become a wanderer, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Because you're going to be a wanderer, you can't make farming your occupation anymore, because there's no way to be a farmer without and wander at the same time. Farming means a stationary focus. You've got to be there to till, to plant, to cultivate, to reap. If you're a wanderer, you can't do any of those things. And so that could be part of it too, a situation that's saying now that you're going to move into wandering as part of the consequence and payment for the rebellion against me, what had formerly been satisfying to you can't be anymore. A third aspect, which is also possibly what's going on here, is he's saying, listen, your diet is no longer going to yield to you what it did previously. In other words, food is not going to be producing the same strength for you. It will sustain you, but you're not going to feel the same energy level, the same haleness, the same robustness of life that would have been true had you been not rebelling against me and doing what I had called for you to do. I mean, that's possible that that's what it means. Is sin impact on the ability of our lives to have the vitality that we would enjoy? I think very much it could. Certainly, the psalmist talks about how when he's in rebellion against God and not handling his sin properly, his strength is dried up like the heat of the summer. It could have that implication. My guess has all three implications. I think we'd be safe with drawing all of them together. Your diet's not going to have as much impact on you as it would have otherwise. Your command from me to have to be a wanderer on the earth is going to make it impossible to carry out the gardening. And even if you did carry out the gardening, it wouldn't be satisfying to you the way it once was. All right, bottom line, consequences for being out of right relationship with God. Lord willing, tomorrow as we join together, we'll look at the final two tragic outcomes. Join me at that time, won't you? And God bless you in this day.